Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In our previous two lectures, we looked at what Hesiod's Theogony, which tells us about the gods, about their creation and the creation of the universe through the creation of the gods, had to tell us about the whole Weltanschauung of the ancient Greeks. In this lecture, we are going to turn to seeing what Hesiod has to tell us about human beings. And we will look first at the myth of Prometheus and Pandora, as it appears in the Theogony, but also as it appears in Hesiod's other great work, a poem called The Works and Days. And we will consider the implications of this myth for the Greek view of society, and particularly of women and gender roles. The Theogony, as I have said several times, concentrates on the coming into existence of the gods. It does not contain a creation story about humans, or at least about men at all. This often surprises modern readers because we assume that how human beings came to be would be one of the primary points of interest in any creation story of the ancient world. But what Hesiod is doing in the Theogony is describing the birth of the gods. They are the focus, and humans are largely irrelevant in that context. And therefore, when human beings are mentioned in the Theogony, or at least when male human beings are mentioned there, Hesiod does not describe how they came to be created. They simply are there. They are taken as a given. Hesiod launches into the one place in the Theogony where he really discusses humans and their relationship with God, simply by stating that when the gods and men met at a place called Mycone, a series of things happened there. He doesn't tell us where these men came from. He doesn't even make it clear immediately that he does mean just men and not men and women. But as the story progresses, we find out that that is, in fact, what he means. So though Hesiod doesn't tell us how men came to exist, he does posit an original state in which humans were males only and there were no women. As I said, the men and the gods met at a place called Mycone. Among other things, what they did there was to establish the appropriate ritual for sacrifice, to establish the way in which men would offer sacrifice to the gods. This was the beginning, really, of all of men's troubles. Though they were trying to set up a way to sacrifice to the gods in order to honor them, the idea of sacrifice backfired for the following reasons. Prometheus was present when the gods and men met in Mycone to work out the method of sacrifice. You remember that Prometheus is a son of Iapetus, one of the original Titans. Prometheus himself is also called a Titan, though actually, if you were to draw up a family tree, you would see that he is Zeus's first cousin, and that he is therefore in the same generation as Zeus, and not and technically therefore distinct from the Titans. He is not one of the Olympians. He is called a Titan because his father, Iapetus, the brother of Kronos, is a Titan, and so therefore he's kind of more associated with them. He is definitely not Olympian, though. In Hesiod's account, Prometheus tries to trick Zeus into taking the less desirable portion of the first sacrifice so that men will have the better portion. What Prometheus does is he disguises the edible part of the sacrificial animal by putting the meat under the hide, the hooves, the horns, and the other parts of the animal that look inedible. And the edible portion he hides under a layer of fat so that it looks like it would be the meat. And then he tells Zeus to choose whichever portion he desires. We read the following in Hesiod. For when the gods and mortal men had a dispute in Mycone, even then Prometheus was forward to cut up a great ox and set portions before them, trying to befool the mind of Zeus. Before the rest he set flesh and inner parts, thick with fat, upon the hide, covering them with an ox paunch. But for Zeus he put the white bones, dressed up with cunning art, and covered with shining fat. And the father of men and gods said to him, Son of Iapetus, most glorious of all lords, good sir, how unfairly you have divided the portions. So said Zeus, whose wisdom is everlasting, rebuking him. But wily Prometheus answered him, smiling softly, and not forgetting his cunning trick. Zeus, most glorious and greatest of the eternal gods, take whichever of these portions your heart within you bids. So he said, thinking trickery. But Zeus, whose wisdom is everlasting, saw and failed not to perceive the trick. And in his heart he thought mischief against mortal men, which also was to be fulfilled. With both hands he took up the white fat and was angry at heart, and wrath came to his spirit when he saw the white ox bones craftily tricked out. And because of this, the tribes of men upon earth burn white bones to the deathless gods upon fragrant altars. But Zeus, who drives the clouds, was greatly vexed, and said to him, Son of Iapetus, clever above all, so, sir, you have not forgotten your cunning arts. Now, so spake Zeus in anger, whose wisdom is ever from everlasting. And from that time he was always mindful of the trick, and would not give the power of unwearying fire to the Melian race of mortal men who live upon the earth. Now, that's the end of the story. There are a couple of points to notice here. First of all, this reflects an assumption that is very frequent in myth, not just in ancient Greek myth, but in most ancient cultures, and in ideological myths in particular. That is the assumption that the way something is done the very first time it is done is the way that it will be done forever after. If Zeus chooses the worst portion on this occasion, then forever after the gods will get the inedible part of the sacrifice, while the humans will get the edible part. Again, there is no strictly logical reason why this should be so. There's no logical reason why the way things are done the first time is the way that they are going to be done forever after. But that shows up very frequently in myth. Secondly, though I said at the end of my last lecture that gods eat ambrosia and drink nectar, apparently at this very early stage of society when things were still kind of being settled, the gods could eat meat if they wanted to, because the idea is here that Zeus could have chosen the edible part of the sacrifice for the gods and left the inedible portion for humans. Now, Hesiod, as we've read, is at pains to show us, to tell us that Zeus is not a fool. Hesiod tells us Zeus knows perfectly well that Prometheus, he knows what Prometheus is doing and is angered by it. In retaliation for his anger at Prometheus, we read that Zeus punishes human beings. And if you recall from my last lecture, I did say that Zeus is the god who has dominion over justice. And this seems like, well, a remarkably unjust act, doesn't it? A remarkably unjust way for a god of justice to deal with human beings, because humans weren't the ones who did anything wrong. Zeus's first reaction to Prometheus's deceit is to punish human beings, as we read here, by hiding from them fire. Okay. Now, Hesiod says quite distinctly that Zeus is punishing human beings. He says that Zeus plots evil for men in his mind because he is angry at what Prometheus did. How can one square this with the idea that Zeus is a god of justice when he punishes innocent men for the transgressions of his own cousin Prometheus? Well, this is the first view we have had of the relationship between gods and humans, as it is delineated in Greek mythology. And I think that that is a very important glimpse. It is a very important glimpse that we are being given here of the Greek view of the way humans and gods interact with one another. These gods do not love humans. They do not feel compelled to treat humans fairly. The relationship between humans and gods, as Hesiod relates it, is not a relationship of love, of compassion, or mercy on the part of the gods. Humans are useful to the gods. Humans offer them sacrifices. They do nice things for them. And so therefore the gods find them useful, but they do not find humans particularly worthy objects of love, of pity, and of mercy. In fact, they find human beings downright expendable. And so in his role as god of justice, Zeus supervises justices between human beings, justice in terms of human actions towards other humans. And he punishes humans who break their oaths towards other humans, and for that matter, towards gods too. But this does not necessarily imply any correlation of a just system between gods and humans. The fact that humans have to treat one another fairly seems not to imply that gods have to treat humans fairly. They don't have to, and they don't, as we will see in a great many of the myths that we will study. And so it is that Zeus decides to punish Prometheus by punishing humans, and he takes away from human beings fire. But Prometheus then steals the fire back from humanity, which brings down further punishment both on his own head and also on men. We read in Theogony, but the noble son of Iapetus, that is Prometheus, outwitted him and stole the far-seen gleam of unwearying fire in a hollow fennel stalk. And Zeus, who thunders on high, was stung in spirit, and his dear heart was angered when he saw amongst men the far-seen ray of fire. Prometheus himself is punished in a way that is extremely infamous. He is chained either to a rocky crag or, according to Hesiod, to a pillar to have his liver eaten out every day by an eagle. Zeus's kind of totem animal is the eagle. Every night his liver grows back because he is immortal, and so but that only goes to kind of prolong his agony, because then the eagle comes the next day and eats his liver again. And one point I would like to stress here again is just what a demonstration this is of how extraordinarily anthropomorphic these gods are. Not only the external appearance of their bodies is like humans, but even their internal organs are like humans. Prometheus has a liver, and it is his liver that the eagle can eat every day, and that will grow back every night. Zeus apparently intends this punishment to be permanent. Prometheus is supposed to be there forever, but in fact he is going to be freed by Hercules, in Greek Heracles, some generations later. Heracles happens to be passing by and unchains Prometheus and lets him go. Now, returning to that's the punishment for Prometheus for doing this. And Prometheus, kind of in subsequent reception, has oftentimes been seen, especially by kind of occultic figures, as sort of like a Luciferian kind of figure, as somebody who's sort of like maybe even in more modern times, as something like a humanistic symbol of humanism, kind of like, battling the gods for the sake of humanity, something like that. Well, what about the punishment of human beings? Men are also punished in a way that Hesiod seems to consider no less horrible than what happens to Prometheus and his liver. Men get women. And the person of the first woman, we are not told in the Theogony. She's not named in the Theogony, but in the Works and Days, which we're going to read in a moment, she is given the name Pandora. But in the Theogony account, this first woman, unnamed, is created and sent to men in general. It's almost as if we were supposed to think that this is kind of like just sort of a generic kind of womankind is being given to mankind. But this womankind is definitely seen as a punishment and a trouble for men. Hesiod delineates very quickly just what a trouble women are. He says they are worthless, they don't contribute anything to their own upkeep, they are a burden and a nag, and you don't want to have them around. But on the other hand, if you don't have them around, then you can't have any children, and one dies friendless, old, and strangers get all of your property. So it's kind of like the most ancient version of you can't live with him and you can't live without him. He does try to end on something of a cheerful note by basically saying there's no way to escape the will of Zeus. And in other words, you're going to suffer no matter what you do. We can just read this very quickly. For from her is the race of women and female kind. Of her is the deadly race and tribe of women, who live amongst mortal men to their great trouble. No helpmeets in hateful poverty, but only in wealth. And as in thatched hives, bees feed the drones, whose nature is to do mischief, by day and throughout the day until the sun goes down, the bees are busy and lay the white combs, while the drones stay at home in the covered skeps and reap the toil of others into their own bellies. Even so, Zeus, who thunders on high, made women to be an evil to mortal men, with a nature to do evil. And he gave them a second evil to be the price for the good they had. Whoever avoids marriage and the sorrows that women cause, and will not wed, reaches deadly old age without anyone to tend his years. And though he at least has no lack of livelihood while he lives, yet when he is dead, his kinsfolk divide his possessions amongst them. And as for the man who chooses the lot of marriage, and takes a good wife suited to his mind, evil continually contends with good. For whoever happens to have mischievous children lives always with unceasing grief in his spirit and heart within him, and this evil cannot be healed. So it is not possible to deceive or go beyond the will of Zeus, for not even the son of Iapetus, kindly Prometheus, escaped his heavy anger, but of necessity strong bands confined him, although he knew many a while. The Prometheus story, therefore, is very important because it highlights several of the problems of studying myth through literature that I touched upon in the first lecture. There are unexplained elements here. Zeus appears to have a grudge against Prometheus and his whole family, for that matter. Prometheus's brother, who you see here in this picture on the right-hand side of the screen, is Atlas. He is the one who you probably know is condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders forever. And here you can see in this artistic rendering there's Prometheus on the right getting his liver chewed out by the eagle, but on the left there is Atlas holding up the world on his shoulders. We are not told why Zeus has a grudge against Prometheus's whole family. That seems to be one of the elements that Hesiod simply assumes his audience can take for granted. Secondly, and more importantly, Hesiod doesn't tell us why Prometheus wants to help humans. Other gods, as I've said, don't seem particularly interested in helping human beings or being kind to human beings. Prometheus, though, goes out of his way and risks dreadful punishment and suffers dreadful punishment for helping human beings. Later authors said that Prometheus was the creator of men, that Prometheus was the one who had created human beings. That is why he wanted to help them, and that is why Zeus thought he could punish Prometheus by punishing men. And that may be true. We don't have those stories, but we have references to that tradition and that assumption. We don't have the early versions of those myths. But it also may be that Hesiod simply assumes we know whatever it is that caused these problems and caused Prometheus to act in the way he did. Or it may be that later authors simply made up this account because of Hesiod's portrayal, and they sort of like, retrojected that idea back onto this earlier tradition. We just don't know. Whatever the case of that may be, Prometheus's story is obviously a very important one, as I say. It has many crucial implications for our understanding of the Greek view of the world and of the human place in it. The first thing to notice is that fire equals civilization. And I touched on this when I talked about Hestia and her role as goddess of the hearth. Perhaps it would be better to say that fire equals culture rather than that fire equals civilization, because without fire there can be no human culture as we know it. And therefore, what Prometheus brings to men is culture when he brings them fire. When he returns fire to them, he is returning culture to them. Later authors will specifically make this equation. In fact, the tragedian Aeschylus has a whole play known as the Prometheus Bound, which may in fact not be by Aeschylus, and it probably isn't. It might be in fact by his grandson, but that's not the point. There is a play, an extant Greek tragedy known as Prometheus Bound, or attributed to Aeschylus, and it has the character of Prometheus say that he, quote, brought men all the gifts of culture, including even writing, the impetus, that is the end of that reference, the impetus for Prometheus' story, the first sacrifice, which leads to the hiding of fire, and therefore which leads to the punishment of that is given to mankind by creating women. This has been looked at by modern scholars as being linked, okay, that there is a just direct link there between this kind of beginning of human culture by the giving of fire and the creation of the first woman. In particular, Walter Burckhardt, who I've talked about on a number of occasions already, that kind of neo-ritualist that I spent a lot of time in my second lecture discussing, he sees that sacrifice here is, because he takes as a given the theory of evolution, he sees as a given here that sacrifice is was the moment at which human beings in their evolution from hominids developed a sense of guilt about killing animals, hunting and killing animals. Okay, that is the idea that sacrifice of animals to deities is the mark of kind of the evolution of human beings when they appeared kind of on the as taking a step outside or beyond simply animals themselves. And he argues further that this first sacrifice would represent the moment at which guilt-free hominids, non-humans, animals who were incapable of feeling guilt made the leap into being humans who could feel guilt. In other words, this moment of the first sacrifice, the moment that guilt enters the moral consciousness, and humans feel the need to expiate that guilt, this would be the moment at which culture or society enters the world stage. Now, of course, this is all just fantasy. This is all just kind of his own speculation. But if one were to read the myth in that way, it would come as no surprise then to kind of further link the idea of the first woman appearing at this point, since one of the main functions of society is, of course, to regulate the relationships between men and women, the connection, therefore, between sacrifice, women, marriage, the problems of marriage. If one were to follow Burckhardt's reading, all of that would be not a coincidental throwing together of elements, but rather a meaningful connection with a representation of the beginning of human culture. However, guilt over the killing of animals is not the only possible guilt that humans might feel in connection with sacrifice. As I mentioned a few moments ago about the choice that Prometheus gives Zeus to choose the better or the worse portion of the sacrifice, in actual Greek ritual practice that we know about through literary and archaeological discoveries, human beings ate the meat of the sacrificial animal, and what was placed on the burning altar, well, that is, what was given to the gods, would have been the bones and the fat and the hide and all the other inedible parts, the horns, the hooves, and that kind of thing. Supposedly, the idea was that the gods enjoyed the savor, the smell of the smoke rising up on the altars, but they did not get the meat, that they did not get the edible part of the animal. Now, when, of course, we look at the myth from outside of its original culture, there is no difficulty at all in understanding why this would be the case. Ancient Greece was a hard place to live. The culture tended to be subsistence. People kind of eked out a meager existence. And in such a society, it would make no sense whatsoever to burn the precious protein that one has spent years, tending and grazing in the field, and to burn that in the honor of the gods when you sacrifice an animal. The only reasonable thing to do would be to have the human sacrificers eat the meat of the animal after it had been sacrificed, because protein was so very hard to come by. And in fact, some of the only times when people in the ancient world ate meat at all were in the big public sacrifices inside of the Greek city-states and afterwards. Oftentimes, the diet of people in ancient Greece is described as what is called the Mediterranean triad. That is to say that there were three main staple foods that people ate basically as their full diets, and those would be grain in the form of bread, wine, red grapes, usually in the form of wine, and olives, olive oil, or the actual fruits of olives. These three things, grain, wine, and oil, were basically the main things that people ate every day. If you got any protein at all, usually it would be fish and maybe some cheese, if you could manage that. Meat, very, very, very rarely. Okay, so some of the only times that one got to eat meat were during these big public sacrifices, when they would sacrifice 100 oxen or something in the city-state, and everybody would get to eat the meat. So the last thing you would do is just destroy all of that meat in honor of the gods. So the only thing that would make any sense at all as a cultural practice is to eat it yourself, and then you have to kind of, and that's of course us looking at it from outside the culture, assuming obviously that these gods don't exist. But if one were to look at it from inside of the culture that developed these myths, with the gods who are awe-inspiring, dangerous beings who need to be propitiated to keep them from, getting angry at you, this is very problematic indeed. Why do human beings get the good part of the sacrifice and throw the bones and the fat to the gods, and along with the hooves and the horns and the hide? So, if there's going to be any kind of sense of guilt here, far from kind of speculating about hominids and all sorts of unprovable things, I think it is very much more likely that if there is any kind of sense of guilt to be shared, it might be, why do humans get to eat the animal and only burn the bones and the fat to the gods? It is probably very much therefore maybe part of this story that the establishment of sacrifice somehow entails punishment for the very establishment of the sacrifice. That is, there is something built into the whole system that needs itself to be punished. The fact that human beings get the good part and the gods get the bad part. So the punishment is, in a sense, built into the whole nature of it. And of course, as we saw, the punishment is the first woman. Now, getting onto that, the story of the first woman occurs not only in the Theogony, but even in more detail in Hesiod's other great work, The Works and Days, which for the most part does not deal with myth. It is mainly kind of a very odd sort of didactic work about farming, as it happens. The first few hundred lines of The Works and Days, however, do deal with myth proper, and among other things, they retell the story of the first woman. And inside The Works and Days, the woman is given the name Pandora. In the Theogony, the emphasis, as we've seen, is on Prometheus's wrongdoing and his punishment, and Pandora, the first woman, is mentioned almost as a sideline. In The Works and Days, however, the emphasis is on Pandora herself. She is named, for that matter, while in the Theogony she is nameless. Now, the name Pandora is ambiguous. It may mean all the gifts, okay, because she was given gifts by all the other deities, as we'll see when we read her story in a moment. It may also mean a gift of all, a gift to all, that is. That is, she is kind of being given to all of humanity, that womankind is being given as a gift to all. It's kind of ambiguous. Oftentimes Greek names in myth are ambiguous in terms of how they actually are meant to be understood. In Works and Days, her creation is described in more detail, as I say, than in the Theogony. We are told that most of the gods and goddesses unite in giving her something, some gifts. Aphrodite, as we will learn in a subsequent lecture, the goddess of romantic love, makes her irresistibly beautiful. Hermes, the messenger god, whom we will talk about later, gives her a thievish nature and the mind of a dog, as Hesiod puts it. Then she is sent in Works and Days, not to men in general, but to Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus. Perhaps the most important detail in the Works and Days story is about Pandora, is that she has with her a jar. I know everybody knows about Pandora's box, but as I'll show you in a little bit, it's actually not a box. And even a jar is actually kind of a stretch. It's more like a big urn. It's called a pithos in Greek. But I'll call it a jar for now. Inside of this jar are contained all of the evils that afflict humankind: diseases, old age, anxieties, troubles, K-pop, you name it. All of the evils of the world are inside of this jar. And in addition to all of those things, there's one more thing that's very strange that's inside of it. And we're going to read that story right now. But Zeus, in the anger of his heart, hid it, that is, fire, because Prometheus the crafty deceived him. Therefore he planned sorrow and mischief against men. He hid fire, but that the noble son of Iapetus stole again for men from Zeus the counselor in a hollow fennel stalk, so that Zeus, who delights in thunder, did not see it. But afterwards Zeus, who gathers the clouds, said to him in anger, "Son of Iapetus, surpassing all in cunning, you are glad that you have outwitted me and stolen fire. A great plague to you yourself and to men that shall be. But I will give men as the price for fire an evil thing, in which they may all be glad of heart while they embrace their own destruction." So said the father of men and gods, and laughed aloud. And he bade famous Hephaestus make haste, and mix earth with water, and to put in it the voice and strength of humankind, and fashion a sweet lovely maiden shape, like to the immortal goddesses in face, and Athena to teach her needlework and the weaving of the varied web, and golden Aphrodite to shed grace upon her head, and cruel longing and cares that weary the limbs. And he charged Hermes the guide, the slayer of Argos, to put in her a shameless mind and a deceitful nature. So he ordered, and they obeyed the Lord Zeus, the son of Cronos. Forthwith the famous lame god molded clay in the likeness of a modest maid, as the son of Cronos purposed. And the goddess bright-eyed Athena girded and clothed her, and the divine graces and queenly persuasion put necklaces of gold upon her. And the rich-haired Hours crowned her head with spring flowers. And Pallas Athena bedecked her form with all manners of finery. Also the guy, the slayer of Argos, contrived within her lies and crafty words, and a deceitful nature, at the will of loud thundering Zeus. And the herald of the gods put speech in her, and he called this woman Pandora, because all they who dwelt on Olympus each gave a gift, a plague to men who eat bread. But when he had finished the sheer, hopeless snare, the Father sent glorious Argos slayer, the swift messenger of the gods, to take it to Epimetheus as a gift. And Epimetheus did not think on what Prometheus had said to him, bidding him never take a gift of Olympian Zeus, but to send it back for fear it might prove to be something harmful to men. But he took the gift, and afterwards, when the evil thing was already his, he understood. For ere this the tribes of men lived on earth remote and free from ills, and hard toil and heavy sickness which bring the fates upon men. For in misery men grow old quickly. But the woman took off the great lid of the jar with her hands, and scattered all these, and her thought caused sorrow and mischief to men. Only hope remained there in an unbreakable home within under the rim of the great jar, and did not fly out the door. For ere that, the lid of the jar stopped her. But the will of Aegis-holding Zeus, who gathers the clouds. But the rest, countless plagues, wander amongst men, for earth is full of evils, and the sea is full. Of themselves diseases come upon men continually by day and by night, bringing mischief to mortals silently. For wise Zeus took away speech for them, so there is no way to escape the will of Zeus. So you see, the thing that is most surprising that was inside of the jar is hope. And we'll talk about that, though, in a moment. Why was it in there to begin with? And why did it stay in there when all the other evils flew out? Before we get to that, though, let's analyze the story in kind of some more detail first. The story of Pandora is very frequently compared to the story of the book of Genesis and the creation of Eve. A lot of mythological handbooks will say that basically they are more or less the same story, that woman brings evil into the world. Now, these similarities are very superficial, and I definitely believe that the differences between the two stories are more significant and more interesting than whatever superficial similarities they might have. And I think the differences are important for our understanding of the relationship between the sexes as it is depicted in Greek mythology, versus how it is envisioned in the book of Genesis. It is true that both Pandora and Eve are responsible for the advent of evil in the world. There is no doubt about that. But Eve was created in the first place as a companion for Adam. God looked at Adam, decided it was not good for him to be by himself, and decided to make a help meet for him in the language of the King James Bible. As we read Genesis 2:18 through 25, and the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an helpmeet for him." And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took out one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and he brought her unto the man. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." So you see, the motivation for the creation of Eve is as a good thing, as a companion, as someone who is equal to the man, who is from the man. They are of the same nature. They are of the same essential humanity. No such vision is given in the Greek at all. In Greek mythology at all. Pandora is evil from her very creation. She is not created to be a help to man. She is created to be a curse to man. She is sometimes referred to as the beautiful evil. This is how Hesiod describes the woman whom he names Pandora in the Works and Days, but he calls her in the Theogony the kalon kakon, the beautiful evil. This is a complete difference in motivation in the creation of the first woman. Also, as I say, Eve is created out of Adam's own body. She is not she's not of a different kind of creature than she is the same kind of creature that he is. Okay. She can be seen as a sort of completion of humanity, being made from Adam's own body. Pandora, on the other hand, is an entirely different creation. She is made not from the same substance as man, or if she is, we are not told so. She certainly is not made from man's own body. She is created separately, individually, and with malicious forethought. This seems to me to imply that women are seen in Greek myth and Greek society as fundamentally different in kind than men, not just as the female of the male of the human species, but as fundamentally of a different species, different in nature and in some sense almost artificial, created as an afterthought. And this is our first example of a very deep-seated misogyny that runs throughout much of classical myth. I've talked in earlier lectures about the anxieties that may be demonstrated by the stories of those female deities competing with their husbands and enlisting their male children to overthrow their consorts. There is more than just anxiety going on in Greek myth. There seems to be a real distrust and a real dislike of women that shows up in many of these stories. And this is our first example of that. If we just go back to Pandora's jar, though, for a moment, and the fact that hope is in the jar, let's think about that, because the presence of hope in a jar of evils is very striking, I think. But it is also extremely difficult to interpret. Many commentaries on Hesiod's works and days, big learned tomes that talk about the meaning of every word and of every line, will say kind of very fatuous bromides like, quote, "The presence of hope in the jar seems very surprising," end quote. And they leave it at that, which doesn't really do us much good. I always like, when I teach myth in the classroom, to send students away one day to think about what hope is doing in the jar, and then have them come back the next class and tell me what they think about it. The most usual suggestion that I get, the most common modern interpretation, is a rather optimistic one, and that is the idea that hope is there to indicate that no matter how bad things get, we still have hope. And that's nice, but I think it actually ignores two very important points. Hope is still in the jar. Hope is not out of the jar. Hope is not out in the world with the other evils or with the evils in general. Hope is still in the jar. Hope is somehow different. Hope's status is somehow different than the other things that were in the jar. And that's, that needs to be explained. And secondly, if hope is a good thing, why is it in the jar of evils to begin with? Okay, what is it doing there? Another interpretation that I get, which is equal but opposite, is extremely pessimistic. Someone will usually say hope's retention in the jar is meant to say that there is no hope, that even that tiny consolation for humankind is utterly absent for the Greeks, that the Greeks were completely, pessimistic. There is no hope. We might as well all lay down and die. No, obviously, I don't agree with this interpretation. I think it goes way too far in the opposite direction. But the truth is I don't have a good answer for this. I'm not exactly sure why hope is in the jar. Over the years of thinking about it and talking about this with my students and others, I've kind of tentatively come to the idea that the key to understanding this may be that the word we translate as hope, which is elpis in Greek, is not an unambiguously good thing. Of course, after 2,000 years of Christianity in the West, we tend to think that hope is unambiguously good because it is seen in a Christian light, right? It is one of the three cardinal virtues: faith, hope, and love. However, the Greek word elpis might be almost better translated here as expectation rather than hope. It can be a good in some instances, but it can also be a bad thing. And if hope is the only thing that gets you through a bad situation and things do come right for you in the end, then hope was a good thing in the Greek mind. But what about if you go for years and years with a false expectation that something will happen, but it never does? And all of your possibilities run out and all of your chances disappear because of the expectation that was never fulfilled. Right? Trust the plan. Maybe she'll call me back tonight. Then hope is a very evil thing. And I think that the ambiguous nature of hope in the Greek sense may be the key point here, that elpis, hope, expectation, could be both good and bad. And this may explain why it was in the jar to begin with, and also why it got caught under the lid of the jar, right? Why it is not entirely out there in the world, therefore entirely evil, nor is it kind of, but it stays in the jar, so it's not entirely evil, but it's not entirely good either. At any rate, that's the best I can do with it. I leave it to you to think about. These are obviously, deep points about life. The whole myth of Pandora lends itself exceptionally well to psychological interpretations. The jar can be read as representing Pandora herself, and that is the kind of the female capacity for childbirth, the womb. I think that is part of why this is an important myth to understand, that it is a jar. The object itself is kind of womb shaped as it is here. You see the as I say, the word is pithos in Greek, which is the pithos on the screen is on the right hand side. The other object that you see on the left hand side is called a kreator, which is a mixing bowl. I only put that there not because it is a pithos, but because it is it depicts on it the giving of all the gods' gifts to Pandora. But as I say, the pithos is almost kind of in the shape of a pregnant female figure. That's kind of the general shape of what a pithos looks like. And if we were to take that idea and kind of look at it in sort of as a womb-shaped object or something like that, if we take it that way, we can follow the idea a little bit further and say that Pandora and all women are as responsible for the evil that they bring into the world in the Greek view as they are for the perpetuation of human life itself. They give birth. They put new humans into the world to experience life, which means experiencing a lot of evil, you see. And this kind of tragic sense of life runs throughout all of Greek literature. One needs only think about Book 24 of the Iliad, when Achilles says that on the threshold of Zeus's palace are two urns, one filled with blessings, one filled with evils. And when a man is born, he gives him a share of each. At the same time that birth inflicts all the evils of life on the individual person who is born, birth also provides the only hope for continuity available to the human race by providing a new generation. Birth, like hope in the jar, is ambiguous. It imposes evil on the individual, but it gives hope to the race. And in this interpretation, the jar, Pandora herself, women in general, as a source of evil, all work together to make a statement about birth, about life, hope, and the perpetuation of humanity. You see, it's all kind of built in there. On a wider level, the whole description of Pandora can be read as reflecting, again, this male anxiety and resentment even about the necessity of male-female relations in society. This is a theme that is surprisingly common in Greek literature. Over and over again, a male character will say something about how he wishes it were possible to get sons without having to resort to women to get them. In one of Euripides's plays, for instance, a character says something about how the gods should have arranged it so that a man could simply go to a temple at night, leave a certain amount of money as a donation, and come back in the morning and have a baby boy waiting for him. None of this dealing with women whatsoever. There's a very strong current in Greek myth about of anxiety and of resentment about the need for male-female relations of marriage and of all of that. In a strongly patriarchal society, and of course the society reflected by Hesiod's works is definitely strongly patriarchal, it is all important for a man to have sons, right? Sons are crucial in such a patriarchal society. They have to have sons in order to perpetuate the family, in order to carry on the family, to leave their property to, and so forth. But the only way to get sons is through women. Therefore, a woman or women can thus be seen as, in some sense, controlling man's ultimate destiny. And if the woman remains barren, the man remains barren also. The man has children only if the woman provides them. Thus, again, the jar, which Pandora can either choose to open or to leave closed, could represent this fear of women's power over reproduction, as it were. The fact that it is not something totally under the man's control. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about mortals here in this lecture, but I want to end this lecture, as I did the previous ones, by recapping some points about the essential nature of the gods themselves, as we have seen them in the Theogony, and even to some degree in the works and days. But I want to do so by picking up some points that I've already touched upon at first and sort of recapping on them. First of all, the very translation of the word theos in Greek for as God is problematic. It is a rather surprisingly misleading translation in some ways because of the assumptions that we make because of 2,000 years of Christianity. Okay, of course, in Christian Greek, this is the same word for God, theos, and because Christianity has shaped Western culture for so many millennia, when we hear the word God, we think about God being the God of the Bible, a God who is everlasting, who is outside of all time and space, who is transcendent of all physical reality, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all merciful, all knowing, almighty. But as we've seen already, all of these characteristics are totally absent from the Greek word, the Greek understanding of their theoi, of their gods. Okay, so now this is the reason why I put the word concept fallacy on the screen here, is because we have to be very careful of this, because we don't want to be amateurish in our thinking about things. The word concept fallacy is to say simply because you use the same word for two different realities, then that means that those two different realities are in fact equal to one another. Okay, this is the same sort of amateurish or sloppy thinking that one hears when you modern day ecumenists, for instance, say that, well, because in Islam they worship the god Allah, and because Arabic Christians worship when they worship Christ, they worship the Trinity. They use the word Allah in Arabic because it is simply the Arabic word for God. That means that the God of Islam and the God of Christianity are the same God. This is a clear example of the word concept fallacy. That simply because the same word is used for two different realities, that those two realities are equal to one another. That is not the case, and this is a perfect example, really, of that. That the gods of the ancient Greeks are certainly not to be confused in any way with the God of the Bible. And in fact, I've even toyed with the idea of teaching a course on Greek mythology without translating the word theos at all and just leaving it in place. Of course, that would be impractical. But the reason why I have even toyed with the idea is because the word God brings with it so many unconscious assumptions from our society, even for atheists too, I would say, because atheists in modern day society, atheism in its modern manifestations really has only come into existence in any real sense since the French Enlightenment of the 1700s, and it is a rejection of the Christian God. Okay, it is not a rejection of pagan Greek gods, and so even in atheism, when a non-believer rejects the belief in God, they are rejecting the belief in the Christian God. So, and all of these assumptions I've said, that God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omnipresent, these are, as I've mentioned several times, are all completely false with reference to the gods of classical mythology. They are not consistently good, they are not consistently merciful, they are not apparently even consistently just towards human beings, or even toward one another. Their anthropomorphism means that they share in humanity's less appealing emotions, as well as in our more appealing ones, I suppose, but they certainly can be cruel, they can be spiteful, they can be jealous, and they frequently are. They know a great deal, but they are not omniscient. They are powerful, very powerful sometimes, but they are not omnipotent, as we've seen already with Zeus and Fate. All of these assumptions, therefore, are false with regard to these gods. And as I've said many times, but it is worth underlining because it seems so strange to our assumptions, they are not transcendent. They are not outside or beyond the physical universe, but are part of the physical universe. According to the earliest traditions we have that we've been working with, especially with Hesiod, they did not create human beings. It is almost as though they are a parallel kind of creature, there being three kinds of living beings in the world as the Greeks saw it: gods, humans, and animals. None of them created the other ones. They are all just simply there. They're taken for granted. And they are not loving caretakers of humanity. They do not care about us as a species, and they very rarely care about us as individuals. There are examples of gods who do feel affection for particular individuals. One could say Athena in the Odyssey seems to feel affection for Odysseus, for example. There are other stories that work in similar ways, but by and large, the gods do not seem to feel affection for individual human beings, and they certainly do not feel affection for humans as a species. We will see this again and again in some of the myths about individual gods that we will go through in the next few lectures. I think part of the reason for this unappealing nature of the gods has to do with their role as personifications or personifications of natural forces. That is, they are personifications of things found in nature, but also of emotions and other natural processes. They're not just personifications. In particular, the Olympians, as we've noted, are not just personifications. There seem to be more than that. Zeus is not just a personification of any one thing. And so, in a system in which the oldest gods, and perhaps ultimately in the earliest incarnations, all of the gods are to some extent personifications of natural forces. Remember that the earlier generations of the gods in Hesiod were kind of more personifications of nature, and they became less of that as the generations go by. So maybe in the earliest strata of these gods, they were simply all personifications of natural forces or processes. Perhaps then it would make sense to conceive of such entities as being totally merciless, as being totally capricious, and not caring about human beings. Because think about it. Do you think of natural forces as having the capacity for mercy? If you're out at the open sea and a storm comes up, would it make sense to ask the storm not to drown you? If you're on land and an earthquake happens, it is useless, to cry to the earthquake. It's not, that saying that you didn't do anything wrong, have mercy on you. Well, that's certainly not going to happen. So if Poseidon is seen on some level as the personification of the sea and of earthquakes, it certainly would make no sense on some level. It would make no sense to call on Poseidon for mercy. Poseidon is acting as natural forces act. Mercy doesn't enter the picture. Of course, as I said, that is not all that is going on with these gods, but I think that explains perhaps why in their original conception in the first place, they were so detached from being anything emotionally that human beings could relate to or have any kind of relationship with. In conclusion, we have talked about now the creation of the gods, about their essential attributes, and about the creation of female human beings. In the next several lectures, we will cover the most important stories about particular individual gods and goddesses, beginning with the next lecture, which will be about Aphrodite. Thank you.